Hello again, everybody, and welcome back. What I'd actually like to talk to you about today is one additional command in SPSS, but yet it's a command that actually is the way to use a number of different commands in SPSS, and that's going to be the compute command. Now, the past sessions I've talked about things like the select command as well as the recode command, and these are both extremely helpful commands, but at the end of the day, they only really do one or two useful things for us. The compute command in some ways is kind of a catch-all in the sense that it's almost a built-in calculator / programming language in SPSS. In other words, it allows us to use the full capabilities of SPSS to really calculate out values for us, but at the same time really to create some new things for us that maybe we wouldn't be able to calculate easily on our own. Now, the data we're looking at today is actually Uniform Crime Report data from 2017. And you can see that it's reported here at the state level, although there are a couple other areas, and here Puerto Rico and the District of Columbia are both included, although they're not states. And what I want to do really quickly is switch over the variable view here, so you can actually see what the file looks like. We have the state listed, and then a little bit further down, we have a population for that state or area, again, because we're talking here sometimes about Puerto Rico or the District of Columbia. You can also see we have a number of crime counts. So we've got murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, and then we've got the sum of those, which is listed as the violent crime. Now, below, we've got burglary, larceny, and motor vehicle theft, and adding those up gives us the property crime. Now, below those, you can see a little bit further down, we also have a series of rate variables. And a lot of the times we decide to use rates so that we can compare different areas. And traditionally speaking, when we talk about crime, particularly at a level like this, we'll talk about things like crime rates per 100,000 people in the population. And what that actually means is that we're going to take the total number of the crime divided by the total population of that area that the crimes occur, and then we multiply it out by 100,000. And that way, when we talk about it, it gives us large numbers rather, that we can say per 100,000. And we'll see some examples of that in just a moment. Now, a lot of the work here has already been done. We've already got these summary variables, and we also have the rates already calculated. But what I'm going to do here is I'm going to, check some of the work to make sure that things add up the way that they're supposed to. And then I'm going to create some new variables as well. For example, here we've got all of these different crimes separated, but I actually think what would make for a good example is to turn around and create instead a total crime variable. And that's going to give us a couple ways to see how we would use the compute command in terms of some real world analysis. Now, when we say total crime here, what we're really talking about is this is a representation of UCR data, Uniform Crime Report data. So this is really just what we would call the Part 1 index crime. So when we say total crime, we don't mean all of the crime or even all of the reported crime, but all of the crime that falls under this sort of Part 1 heading. So we know that to calculate total crime, I can go about this two ways. One is I could simply add the violent crime and the property crime variables together. And if I did that, the sum of those would be total crime. The other option I have is that I could add up the individual murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, theft, and motor vehicle theft together to also get total crime. Because again, it should be redundant, right? These four made up violent crime and these three made up property crime. Now I'm going to be a little bit lazy here, and I'm just going to use the two, the variable 4 and variable 9 is listed here, the violent and the property crime totals. But I could go the other way if I was concerned at all about the fact that maybe the variables weren't added up right or weren't calculated right. So let's go ahead and compute a new variable. So if I go up to transform, you can see right away the first item listed is compute variable. So let's click that. Now, I've already stretched this out to make sure you can see, but you can see here that the setup is a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. First of all, we have a target variable over here on the left. And now notice, by the way, that just like normally when we use SPSS, we have a series of variables listed out, and then we've got the arrow over here, which tells us that we can move the variables over. But notice that the variable is going to be moved over to the area called numeric expression, right? The arrow is pointed over there, not to target variable. And that's because target variable is actually going to be the new variable that we're going to create. So in this case, I'm going to call that target variable, that new variable we're creating, total crime. Now remember, whenever we're using SPSS, variable names cannot start with a number and they cannot have a space in them. So in this case, I've done total and I've done an underscore and then crime. So that way I know exactly what it is and I'm still following the rules SPSS requires. I could also, by the way, just take the underscore out and just make it total crime basically as one word. I like this a little bit better. Now, you can see here in the middle, we basically have kind of a calculator pad, right? We've got the numbers, all our traditional arithmetic options, and a couple others that we don't normally get. And we'll talk about some of those later. But for now, we want to just do a very simple expression. Property crime plus violent crime to equal total crime. So you can see here again, total crime. We have an equals, and now the numeric expression. So I'm going to go over here on the left. I'm going to highlight violent crime, and I'm going to move it over. And what I just said a moment ago was exactly what I want to do. I want to add violent crime and property crime, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to select plus, and I'm going to come down here to property crime and move that over as well. So my numeric expression is a very simple one. Property crime plus violent crime equals total crime. Or to read it as I've got it up on the screen, violent crime plus property crime is going to equal total crime. And once I've done that, I can say OK. And you can see right from our output file, again, we see the SPSS syntax at play. Compute our new variable of total crime equals the simple numeric expression we talked about a moment ago, violent plus property crime. I'm going to minimize this, and I'm going to go to my data view. But before I do, you can see right away at the very bottom of my list of variables, I have a new variable, total crime, just the way we typed it in. And if I go to data view and I scroll all the way over, remember new variables show up at the bottom of the list on the variable view, and they show up all the way to the right on my data view. I can see I've got my new column, total crime. Now, there are decimal places here. They're not really necessary because they're count data. And in fact, if we go back and look at the counts variables we had at the beginning, you can see none of these have decimal places. If I go back to my variable view, you can see that those decimals have all been turned off. They've been set to 0. It's only when we get to the rate variables that we have a decimal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have the total crime, replicate those values up at the top, and I've made the decimal 0. Now if I go back to my data view and scroll all the way over again, I can see those decimal places are gone. Now, this total crime is a representation of the sum of violent crime and property crime for each row separately. So you can see for the first row, in this case we're representing the state of Alabama, we had 25,551 violent crimes. We had 144,160 crimes. If I add those together, I should get 169,711 crimes. And you can see the numbers vary because, of course, each row is representing a different state or area. And so it's representing those values. Now, you might say, well, okay, so that's the count. What can we do about calculating out the crime rate? In this case, the total crime rate. And I'd say, well, we can do that easily with, once again, the compute command. So I'm going to go up to transform. I'm going to go compute. And now notice, by the way, in my list here on the left, total crime is now listed as a variable we can use. And that's great because we're going to use it to make this easy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to reset this because I don't need any of the stuff listed up at the top. And I'm simply going to create a new variable. In this case, I'm going to call it total rate. And I know what that's going to refer to in this case, the total crime rate. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say, all right, I need to do a division and I need to do a multiplication. Because we're going to divide the crime by the population and then we're going to multiply it out by a large number like 100,000. Now, one of the ways that we can always guarantee that the operators are calculated in the direction or in the order that we want is we can do exactly what we used to do when we took algebra class, right? We put things in parens to ensure that they're done in the correct order. So I'm going to say total crime gets moved over. I'm going to say divide that by, and I'm going to come up here, population. I'm going to close the parens, and I'm using the keyboard here, but I could also use the brackets as they're listed here. And then I'm going to go a step further, because this would just tell me crime divided by population. I'm going to go the step further and do this all in one swoop. I'm going to say multiply, and as you recall, the asterisk is going to represent multiplication for us. And then I'm going to say 100,000. And so again, the brackets or the parens ensure that what's getting done inside is going to get done first, and then we multiply that out by the 100,000. And when I say OK, I can see once again, I get my SPSS syntax, total rate is equal to, and it tells me basically what I just told it. And if I go back to my my data view, and I scroll all the way to the right, as you can imagine, lo and behold, I have a new variable called my total rate. And this allows me then to be able to compare across these states. And so while, for example, we can see that our first row is representing, and I can go back here and cheat if I want to. I've got Alabama, and then say 3 and 4 are Arizona and Arkansas. I can see that despite the fact that they actually had very large differences in terms of the actual counts of crime, Alabama had 170,000, Arizona had 240,000, Arkansas had 110, that while those counts are very different, the rates actually aren't that different. And that's because, as we would imagine, and I don't want to turn this into a discussion of theory, but the more people we have, the more opportunities we have for crimes. And so, as we can imagine, we have a relatively, for some of these areas, reasonably similar crime rates once we control for that population. Now, I'm going to go back to the compute command one more time here. I'm going to transform. I'm going to compute. And I'm going to reset this. And one of the things I wanted to show you over here on the right-hand side is the fact that there's actually a great deal or a large number of commands that can also be done in the program in SPSS. And I really can't take the time to go through all of these, because as I scroll through these, you can see that there's literally hundreds listed out here. But a lot of times when we're using a program like SPSS and we need to start converting data, this becomes a really simple way for us to have a lot of different commands at our fingers. You can see here that while this is a list of all the different commands, this is a list of function groups that those commands fall under. So there's arithmetic ones where we can calculate logs out, random values, or rounding values, excuse me. We can do date creation. We can go down a little bit further. We have got commands for missing values. We can go down in terms of string variables, and string variables are when our variables are actually made of text, and so we can have a lot of control over those variables there. So we've got a lot of different options, a lot of different things that we can do under compute, and very often when we start modifying our data or creating new variables, this becomes a command that plays a large part for the work we're going to do. Well, I'm not going to go through any more here. In part, my goal is just to make sure you are aware that the compute command exists. And as you're working through a database, very often you're going to, as you go, find the things that you need to do, and you'll figure out which command you need to go to from there. If you have any questions, as always, you're very welcome to contact me. And as always, I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.